Hello everyone, today we talk about ancient Egyptian siege warfare and machinery, mostly from the Old to the New Kingdom. It's not a particularly documented topic. We mostly rely on iconography, particularly as far as the technical side of the story is concerned, naturally. But considering the times and places, still the information we have is quite relevant and worth being examined. I made a similar video about the much later Assyrians that are also not just more documented but more famous for their for the development of what is essentially the first truly statally maintained army by a certain degree in the history of mankind, and their important, in fact, polyurcetic capacities. So siege methods during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, so we're talking from the 27th to the 17th, in fact, century BC, included pretty standard means that you can imagine, as the use of battering rams. Of course, there was a lot of counter siege capacity, and the fact, of course, we cannot see everything doesn't actually mean that we don't have an idea of how siege warfare worked at the time. We will make also more comprehensive videos about this topic entirely, aside from this kind of time and spaced sections, and we will list now a number of siege devices that are particularly relevant. Unfortunately, as it often happens since last year, when I became more straight about the copyright issues, I cannot provide you with all the actual visual information that I'm discussing. It's mostly, however, a conceptual thing. I know that most of you are not here for the pictures that are the least important side of the story. After all, they provide with a bit more of atmospheric context, let's say, but very often these images are it's not much that when they're present they're copyrighted, that just some of them don't care about them, and objectively some details of millennia old tombs that also nobody in practice, unless he's a specific expert about these topics, has even heard of, right? So the even the visual, I have the copyrighted evidence, so I can look at it, but I can tell you that again it's mostly the concept that is worth examining as always, rather than just the graphic. But I'm sorry for not being able to provide more of this. I could also draw some sketches myself, but which I did in the past, and I keep doing, especially when I talk about battles, and in that case maps are a bit a must. But in this case, just if you listen and am able to provide you with the right information, it's basically the same. So there is naturally a problem in the way we approach this evidence, because siege warfare as portrayed in tombs is not perhaps the best type of evidence in many ways. There are two private tombs in the late Old Kingdom contained scenes portraying siege warfare. The 5th dynasty tombs, so we are in the early 25th to mid 24th centuries BC, of Inti at the Shasha and Kamasat at Saqqara, are quite famous sources for siege warfare. I also would like to point out that most of these names probably are pronounced in very different ways. As we'll see, we'll talk about the pharaoh, who would be spelled Piye, which reads Punk instead, right? So, albeit the previously pronounced names before, especially the ones of the localities, shouldn't be different. In any case, a crucial issue with the aforementioned images, as with, generally speaking, the proto-dynastic material altogether, concerns the extent to which we can regard them as depictions of real, factual events, right? This may be a problem in two ways. One is more relative, that is to say, okay, this is a fictional event that never happened historically, but still it's depicted realistically. The other is, what were the actual cannons used to depict such siege warfare, right? How realistic were they, tactically, operationally, right? In what they depict. Consider that here we could extend the topic naturally to fortifications, but it wouldn't be the case in this video specifically, but it's obvious that the two things are in function of each other. Today we talk just about siege tactics, right? That are, as we will see, are relatively simple, but reading again the evidence does pose some methodological problems. Now, the tomb of Inti incorporates a depiction of a battle in front of an Asian fortress, likely a fortified settlement in southern Palestine, right, where the Egyptians were often campaigning, which can be broken down essentially into three sections from top to bottom, the scenes of which are meant to be read in consequential chronological order. So in the upper register, there is a squad of Egyptian archers assembling. In the two middle registers, the Egyptian infantry, armed with battle axes, are engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the defenders of the fortress, some of whom are pierced by arrows. So we get this preliminary, apparently operational procedure. There was a big deal of archery taking place during such encounters, which is real, right? We know that ancient medieval warfare were mostly about this, was about primarily suppressing the enemies on the top of the walls, where naturally they enjoyed an important advantage because of altitude and the gravitational difficulty posed by the attackers to climb with ladders the walls, but also the advantage provided for the defenders as well in throwing projectiles downwards, right? And we have, in fact, also a storming assault infantry that is equipped with battle axes, right? So these guys are fundamentally the shock infantry, the stormtroopers. And the consequential order here suggests naturally there was a preliminary suppression phase, after which, or during which, maybe contemporary, the assault infantry attacked. We have seen assault infantry equipped with axes capable of inflicting pretty hard chopping wounds or blunt trauma in case of armored opponents, breaking bones underneath it, etc. So these are the properly the shock assault force that is needed to break through quickly, right? Because the enemy still, in relative terms, does enjoy an important advantage presented by the defense. Not only, the axes are probably designed also for breaking the enemy fortification as well, right? Wood, walls made of, mud, bricks, etc. That, as we will see, and as we've seen also, for example, in Assyrian warfare, were unhinged also just with poles, right? So not just with siege machinery properly made, but something looking like long lances, etc. And the Egyptians did have this. Now we will see it in the Beni-Hasan evidence, and that therefore could open paths, literally making paths through such fortresses, through such obstacles. We have seen Assyrian pioneers using these axes as well, and being armored very often. Here there is no such thing, but there are also pretty early times considered. So what is heavy or light depends, is always relative to the type of enemy that you find, right? So it's not a absolute standard way of saying this is heavy or light infantry, like in this case. And the interesting aspect of this is, of course, that the defenders are pierced by arrows as well, which is what you would expect to have happened during this clash. But as we will see, the attackers would have suffered important losses in the process as well. This is not represented. Right? So always remember, these are not meant to be properly realistic scenes. They have to tell something, right? They have to provide you with a narrative, with a story, with an image that makes you see something. In this case, the victory of the assaulters. And in the lowest register, which is terrifying but beautiful, the Asians are being marched off into captivity along with their wives and children, right? Which was already a big deal. They hadn't been exterminated, as often happened also in these times. While to the right of their image, a ladder is used to ascend the wall of the fortress, the foot of which is being mined by two soldiers with picks, by the way. So we see here it's not really clear what happened, because ladders would have been used during the assault mostly. So at this point you have the enemies having already surrendered in a situation in which, probably these were not very large settlements, but still, so it could happen all very quickly in a way. But still, we think that the storming phase would have already happened, right? The invaders at this point would have simply entered the settlement from other ways, and or also the latter. But where did this guy, the inhabitants came out from, right? From the ladders themselves, not really. So as they had come out, the enemy could enter also through gates, doors, etc. Also, we see a further specialization of two Egyptian soldiers with picks that are literally, in fact, mining the foot of the fortress. So they are raising it to the ground, in other words, which was yet another strategic precaution to say, okay, let's make a tabula rasa this all, and so that they will not begin, at least if they begin to resettle here, it will take some time before they are able to do it. And in the meanwhile, we can hope to intervene again without having to storm these damn walls again, right? But the picks naturally different from the axes and are more specific nature. Consider also in other times the pickaxe dolabro of the Roman legionnaire, right? That was used also in combat for that matter, but of course was a working tool. So this depends, but still it's significant that there is this differentiation between the weapon and the tool per se. Can't be the same thing at the same time. Now, in terms of the human reactions to battle, the events show essentially on 5 registers in the interior of the fortress are perhaps the most revealing, like including scenes of defenders apparently being struck by their wives, right? The idea of being cowards that had failed, that had not died to defend their families, so they were still alive to essentially shame their own family forever, if anything, because they were deported in slavery, is quite meaningful. And this also shows, like, we defeated these guys, they were not even good at dying for their own families, right? And at the time, really considering the cost of life, you would have been more inclined perhaps to get killed yourself at some point. In any case, in the top register, a man is breaking his bow before the gaze of his family as well, which also is interpretable as the archetypal gesture of surrender. Meaningfully, it's a bow, so showing, of course, the preeminency of this weapon culturally in this context, and the fact, as we've seen, that defenders in the battle scene were being targeted themselves, probably targeting the enemy as well, with the same bows, by the same bows. Regarding the accuracy of these depictions, it's important to remember that Inti, whose tomb this was, had a career as royal official, right? Is indicated by his title of overseer of royal fortresses specifically, so he knew some thing or two about presumably siege warfare, and as well as him being a local governor or nomarch as well, so having this broader also military organizational responsibility. Then there is the tomb of Kamasat, which is probably roughly contemporary with that of Inti, right? There is considerable debate concerning its date, but roughly we're in the same time. Well, there is a portrayal here of what appears to be a scaling ladder on wheels. This is particularly important because it demonstrates that the wheel was known before the Hyksos, that, as you know, ruled between the 1650-1550 in the same Egypt, and were associated with this, greater, technology also based on chariot, but also the sickle sword or the composite bow, right? But this theory is disputed, in fact, by other. But this one of Kamasat's no, it's just an example. But let's say, as most things happen technologically, they spread sometimes in the same times in different places, right? In any case, this is not much the point. There is a scaling ladder on wheels, meaning that it's properly a framed structure that is more stable, properly on the ground and not on the walls, where the enemy can also, pull the ladder back, making the assailant fall. This is something that rests on itself on the ground. It can be pushed against the walls, under the walls, more comfortably through the wheels, right? This is used in the siege. There is also there's a small cameo scene of a man driving his sheep and cattle into a wood, presumably to prevent their capture by the Egyptians. In this background, in other respects, this scene in Kamasat's tomb closely resembles that of Inti, so that it's been hypothesized that both scenes here in the two tombs may be based on original prototypes imagery, perhaps deriving from artists that worked for the elite group based in the capital of Memphis. And this would affect naturally the way we look at the historicity of such old kingdom images of battle, right? So that you would mostly associate them to some kind of generic repertoire than actually a portrait of actual historical events. But as we were saying before, this is also relative in importance. I mean, how do you think that siege warfare really differed, right, from place to another at this time, right, in the 25th, 24th century BC, right? More or less, the techniques were the same. The concepts here that are being displayed are also some that you will find later on, right? For example, the wheel scaling ladders are eventually some kind of prototypes of siege towers and so on. We know that things would evolve in that direction, and that, generally speaking, they had an obvious function. So it's not that they were really inventing them. And also, the general depiction is plausible, right? So they're not showing anything particularly strange here. And there's been also debate as to whether the inhabitants of the besieged town, in this case, were Asian or Egyptian, right? And looking at paintings in Kamasat tomb, some scholars suggested that the women wear Asian dress similar to that portrait also, in the mortuary complex of Sauron. Then there is a further early private tomb containing images of siege warfare in what seems to be like a Syro-Palestinian setting, dating to the 11th dynasty. So we are between 2150 to 1991 BC. In the tomb of Intef was contemporary with King Nebepetra Mentuhotep II. And Intef's tomb in the XXIV region of western Thebes was decorated with texts and images, reflecting, even in this case, a military career as overseer of troops or general, it could be translated like. And this included a portrayal of what appears to be a successful siege of an ancient fortress, and the subsequent butchering this time, and also capture of its Palestinian inhabitants. An important aspect of this scene is also the presence of Nubian archers within the Egyptian army that we recognize because of their distinctive costume. I made a video about the ancient Palestinians, Philistines, that were distinguished by Egyptian art in different ways, mostly by their caps, etc. But what interests here is the use of a wooden siege tower, this early, pushed up against the fortified town wall, and allowing thus the Egyptian soldiers to enter the besieged town. The fragments of painted battle scenes for the mortuary temples of Intef's ruler Mentuhotep II, that is now scattered across the collections of the British Museum, the Royal Ontario Museum, and the Metropolitan in New York, may even depict the same siege scene, one in Intef's tomb. Now, two of the fragments show parts of a scene of soldiers ascending a siege ladder with enemies. There are agents, or actually even also fellow Egyptians, falling around them, pierced by arrows. So we get again the important suppression, but also distraction fire against the enemies on the battlements, and these ladders and siege towers as well, that may have developed in the meanwhile, exactly in these last centuries of the third and in fact the beginning of the second millennium BC. Pretty normal. A very important depiction that we were hinting at before is also the one in the tombs of two still 11th dynasty provincial governors, Kati and Bakht III at Beni-Hasan. Some say it's 12th dynasty, but we're talking about roughly I think these tombs have been dated to 2160, 2040 BC, right? In any case, we're more or less still in the same time, and they are these two tombs are numbered at Beni-Hasan because there are several, BH 15 and 17 respectively, right? Beni-Hasan 15 and 17. And they include depictions of Egyptian soldiers laying siege to fortified towns within the same Egypt, which, with a few doubts, directly reflects the civil wars that had taken place in Middle and Upper Egypt in the late First Intermediate period. This is interesting because naturally it would, and it does, provide with a different narrative from the usual. Let's go subjugate the evil Philistines and these other barbarians, right? The Egyptian fortification is depicted with crenellated walls topped and strengthened with a slight batter at the base. The picture is actually on 3 levels, the 2 upper ones of which are occupied by in height by the fortress, right? So they depict this, sort of perspective, right, between there are the lines of troops that are meant to be all around the fortress, defended by an equally crowded garrison, and most troops fundamentally are made up of archers and javeliners. There is, however, an important device here we observe, constituted by a long-shafted weapon with, here we don't really see it well depicted, but presumably provided with a hefty metal point, which required 3 men to wield, and this probably was meant to stick it into the matons, and by moving it from the making leverage, kind of trying to break the fortress and or to keep enemies away from the ramparts in order to enable what is not depicted, but as we've seen, they existed, siege towers, ladders to be placed against the walls for the infantry to storm the fort. And the interesting part of this, perhaps, is that the crew is protected, what in the depiction looks like, just like a roof on the guys, like a cabin, right, arriving also at the on Earth, but that is more likely like a large shield, right, rather than a cabin. Also because, the cabin would have been heavier had it covered the entire this entire team of 3 that was probably required to wield this long shaft, and that could have in fact just been turned against the fortress with no risk of having fire coming from other directions, given that here the assailants had surrounded the fortress in the first place, noticeably, while the assault is in course, the infantry is shooting arrows, right? There are also enemies falling from the ramparts, right, and arrows also falling on the assailants. And this looks quite accurate and kind of dynamic after all, right? There is a set, especially at the bottom level, there is a set just of javeliners that probably were kind of probably waiting. Right here, they're not depicted, maybe because they're not represented on the same level of the 2 upper ones where the fortress is, etc. But these look like, yes, they keep their javelin right over arm, and it may seem as if they were throwing it, but not quite like the javeliners that actually are depicted. I think, they're pretty much the same, actually, the ones that are depicted also on the upper levels. At least there is only one of among the assailants, and I can't see really maybe a javeliner among the defenders. In any case, there is a guy who I think is arming his bow, rather, but they keep their arrow with like a hand up, and the bow is down in the other hand. So I don't understand what they're doing, if they're throwing darts or something. In any case, it may mean that the javeliners, however, at the bottom of the picture were just more like awaiting for the garrison to be suppressed on the ramparts before kind of closing in more safely and or storming. There are two doors, 2 gates in this fortress, right, over the batter at the base. So this is an interesting and kind of still plausible, right, realistic depiction. Interestingly enough, looking at the arrows that the garrison pours on the assailants, connections with the numerous wounds found on the real heads of 60 11th century Egyptian soldiers buried in a mass grave near the mortuary complex of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahari, right? Which may very well bear witness to the fatal consequences of attempting to storm such battlements, right? This is where warriors were buried there. They had been killed by these repeated hits that you may think easily were coming from the fortifications. This is often an overlooked aspect of ancient and medieval warfare. That is how much stuff the defenders were able, but also the assailants were able to throw at the enemy at once, right? And how it's not really easy to kill with that force at the first hit, right? So very often, as it happens in warfare, it could take a lot actually of wounds before taking out these people, and the fact that these wounds, the wounds of the latter are soldiers in the mass grave, are on the head. This may well derive from, projectiles thrown by the garrisons defending themselves in fortresses during the attacks of these soldiers. It's possible, of course, that there was some, parabolic fire also in normal engagements in our situation, but this concentration, like in a, is more typical of siege warfare. It's something that we find. Pick the horrendous wounds, for example, the Swedish at Visby. That in that case we're also defending. So that's an interesting side of the story as well. Also about this pole that we have described, some have associated to a sort of battering ram, right? And it's something perhaps more specifically anti-man and or, yes, of course, with anti-structural, let's say, structurally destructing capacities. But let's say it could be associated also to that kind of one of the early forms of ramming in a sense, right? Even though the concept is entirely fluid, right? Siege warfare is one of the military fields with more ingenuity and kind of adaptation also to the ground, to the circumstances, can make such operations and relative equipment vary, right, depending on. And so, yes, it's homogeneous, but also it depends on the circumstance. In any case, what is also very interesting about this picture is that it's a purely military one, right? As we have seen in the case of Inti, Kamasat, and Inti, Wu's tombs all depict Asian sieges, right? So sieges that the Egyptians were carrying out at the expense of foreign peoples. This picture in the tomb of Kethi doesn't have any apparent pictorial reference, for example, to panic, surrender, enslavement of the occupants, right? Which perhaps suggests that the wars between the Egyptians were kind of less crude, or at least, had kind of different, simply political ends or strategic aims, than essentially the reprisals taken also terroristically against the Asians, right? So here the depiction is supposed to suggest kind of more, a greater nobility of the defenders, that in this case in fact seem to be more active. Like, they're not just losing, they don't look like in a good situation, but still they're quite active. Still they're provided with kind of greater individuality. It's just the same figures are more detailed. They're more aggressive, like they're more active again in their defense, and there is no kind of humiliation of the same. So suggesting that this was just an internal game, right? As Huizinga would have said regarding these things, I disagree with him on the terminology, or at least the way he interprets war. Like, in any case, I say a more mediated, kind of civilized and almost chivalric way of war, right, against a common people, also provided with that dramatic, divine and imperial nature that made them think to be superior to anybody else. So they wouldn't depict the same degree of horror, humiliation, destruction against the barbarians that they portrayed elsewhere. Now, speaking briefly of the New Kingdom, so say between the 16th and the 11th centuries BC, cities were assaulted by the Egyptians through breaches in the walls, depicted clearly and probably created either by ramps or mining. The early example, as we have seen with the guys with the picks that are mining the walls, etc., could represent operations that could be carried out and would be carried out normally also during combat, right? Because every time like somebody was approaching with a ram covered, as we will see in some way by the aforementioned shield with some kind of pent houses, etc., there would be still an enemy reaction, right? So siege warfare in this sense is always kind of continuous, relentless, subtle, centrimetric, we could say, in terms of improvements, but still solidly going towards a direction. So we have to think that even the complexity of the fortifications and the counter fortifications was important, right? Also earthworks, etc. And in the New Kingdom, we still see, as it's again normal, elite units usually leading the assault. So the heavier troops that were the ones required properly with the mindset and physicality and the training and equipment better suited for that kind of breakthrough, like Stoßtruppen. Now, other methods were to assault the walls with scaling ladders, as we've seen, or destroy the gates with axes or fire. Naturally, much material, also the superstructures, etc., was flammable. And so also a wooden gate could be broken with axes, even if it was reinforced with other materials, etc. So the axes are always important in that regard. And the two things could again happen at the same time. Normally, when you attack a fortress, you attack along the wall perimeter so that you dilute the enemy responsive capacity on a specific sector of the ring, and you can carry out different things at the same time. Naturally, you need an important superiority, but this was often done, and this was the point of siege warfare, not just in Middle Ages. Fortresses were quite effective, even when manned by a few troops. So this was kind of the thing, normally managing to achieve that relative superiority to break through in a way or another, right? Distracting the enemy with an assault somewhere and breaking another section of the walls in this way, was vice versa. We know also some tricks, some ruses and stratagems, such as an assault party being smuggled into Joppa hidden in baskets, like in Hollywood's Best Feats, but in an historically accurate way. Naturally, these things were done in contexts, again, that were already kind of open, right? When you think about siege warfare, you don't have to think of, let's say, just a purely like video game situation when it's a purely military thing, right? There are people closed somewhere, and you just have to fool somebody and nothing else to get in. No, there is a broader political situation where lots of people are from your side or not, etc. And I studied medieval siege warfare pretty in detail at some point to know that most of these, first of all, it's a pretty universal kind of military situation in the first place, right? Everybody essentially used the same means for millennia, right? There was nothing specific about this context compared to another. But also there is very often, I don't know, a set of non-completely fortified areas, right? Settlements that are maybe just fortified on one side, not in another, and one section of the settlement is going to open maybe their own side of the gates, of the walls, letting you in some other way. And so this really depended. It could take many different forms. Reliefs of the siege of Dapur in Canaan at the Ramesseum show troops approaching the walls under cover of penthouses, which would be made of fabric stretched over a wooden frame, right, and concealing a small assault party from missiles. So some broader covers, like kind of the pseudo type of concept where you have no better protection. You use these structures and or shields that factually are the same thing, and this also by composition by a certain degree with the individual ones, and you approach the enemy walls like that, right? They're not indestructible, they're not just they may not prevent you from being hit, especially by large stones and things like that. You can smash through the same structures. Is relatively tenuous, but again, very often in war, what you use is what is good enough. It doesn't have to be the best. It has to be what works, right? And even in here, you can think of all the various shades of materials, in terms of quality, of quantity available, and again, every of the many clashes that simply we will never know nothing about were different, each one in their own way. And so we're talking, by the way, the general premise I could make for this video, we're talking about millennial history, pretty large also space. So surely there are dynamics that you can trace always, again, from a political, social standpoint that would reflect themselves in the way these military operations were waged, in which types. It could vary, I don't know. By the Middle Ages, we can see the variation, maybe in various decades. By the 14th century, where I studied. Here, we have just a few scattered references for millennia of warfare, right? So this tells you how much we don't know and how active and dynamic this war was, and how probably, in fact, most of the even of the siege devices, etc., that we notice, here there is this, but maybe it was much older, right? But very much older, considering that we have a few evidence in again, millennia of history, so the degree of mistake can't cover centuries or millennia even. So it's always, the problem with this early history and, scarcely documented in absolute terms realities. But still we see also an important Egyptian dynamism, of course, regarding to it from the few evidence that we have. And it's obvious that in later periods, siege techniques became more sophisticated. Generally speaking, civilization developed. The aforementioned Punky pharaoh stela, dating to the late 8th century BC, when really lots of things had been changing. Mentions siege towers, battering rams, siege ramps. So all the type of fortifications and earthwork that you can imagine being at that point also much more functionalized, systematic, considering also other peoples at that point, like the Assyrians, that also were bringing more of that in the system itself, stimulating further military development. Consider briefly we will talk about fortresses on another occasion, and it's always more like a history of engineering, architecture thing than actually military history, because you can understand something from that, but again, that's the other divide that somebody does usually. What kind of building is military and which is not. Doesn't mean anything. Like, anything can have a strategic value and function, right? The fact that there are specifically designed structures for warfare is a pretty modern concept. It did not exist, especially in these times, more than much, right? Of course, the city wall was importantly military oriented, let's say. But for example, Egyptian cities contained vast temple enclosures, which were used as fortresses in times of emergency, but just as enclosures were in practice about that in the first place by some degree, right? So you can never say this was or wasn't conceived for some sort of military purpose. Memphis was captured by Punky by means of amphibious assault through the harbor, for example. So speaking of what and how you could enter a city, let's say, through various means that may have been properly designed for that specific type of settlement and situation. It's just a matter of how much you can afford to spend for it and how much is at stake, and they would make it happen, right? So also amphibious warfare is very, very, and naval warfare in general at the time, very fascinating, but we will see this all on another occasion. So this was just a brief video. As you understand, there is a lot of chit chat rather than technical aspects, but still reflecting on, again, the same point, right? Were we talking about the Middle Ages? We've had plenty more of evidence in many ways, but the task of the military historian, especially of the historian of the military art, is that of properly understanding diachronically and comparatively what, even in the absence, in fact, of satisfactory evidence, but also the times, what it could be like having, by analogy with all the due quotients, because of course you don't have that evidence, but still, right, the obvious sense and meaning and functionality that certain tactics would have, and so how the technology would adapt to it and provide with the desired means, let's say. So again, it takes sometimes scholars concentrate so much on their own field of specialization that they, as minds, they become in function of the same. It should be the other way around, right? The historian should know a lot to the point of saying, even when there is a few units, how it would be like, right? So we should importantly be able to reverse this idea, meaning that if you don't have evidence, it means that it's not there. You can't say that it was there. Doesn't mean anything, right? Because nobody has any certainty about anything. Science is just pure conjecture by essential definition, right? It turns out to be working. So given that something happened in the past, we can test whether it worked, but we know it worked in the sense that humanity evolved in ways that are pretty much responding very often at the same means, right? So you just know that something was there, even if it's not documented sometimes, but you need to have a progressed awareness, right? And experience and competence in order to make that assessment, right? The problem is that, again, we have scholars that are not habituated to do that ever, so they say, if I can't do it, nobody else can do it. It's because they haven't been there yet, right? And so there are people who maybe spend entire pages saying, oh, look, I found this depiction of this guy's like in the 3rd millennium BC. It's all a problem in Egyptology now because of the warfare, siege warfare at the time. If the same depictions we saw today were had been in a medieval manuscript, probably would have been largely ignored. And that's how very often certain, say, branches of history are just subordinated to the to the lack of evidence rather than the meaning of the evidence itself, right? So it's a proof of civilizational decadence, right? Of intellectual shrinking, and unfortunately, it's still how these sectors produce as a consequence of their own categorization. But this is a completely yet very important topic that maybe we'll discuss at some other point. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.